She sabotaged my drink while smiling at her mother, so I let them taste the same mistake. Chapter 1. The Perfect Daughter-in-Law. The autumn breeze swept through the manicured streets of Westfield, New Jersey, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of another suffocating family gathering. I pulled my Honda Civic into the circular driveway of the Morrison family estate, a sprawling Tudor-style home that screamed old money and older traditions. The perfectly maintained lawn stretched like a green carpet, punctuated by ornamental shrubs that probably cost more than my monthly rent. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I stared at the imposing front door, its brass knocker gleaming in the October sunlight. 3 years. 3 years of dating David Morrison, and I still felt like an imposter every time I stepped foot in this house. My stomach churned with a familiar mixture of anxiety and resentment. "You can do this, Maya," I whispered to myself, checking my reflection in the rearview mirror. My dark hair was pulled back in what I hoped looked like an effortless chignon, though it had taken me 40 minutes to achieve. The navy blue dress I'd chosen was conservative enough to pass Mrs. Morrison's unspoken dress code, but stylish enough to maintain some sense of my own identity. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I want to know, where in the world are you watching this video from? And mention your city too. I grabbed the bottle of wine from the passenger seat, a modest Pinot Noir that had set me back $60. Money I really couldn't afford on my teacher's salary, but showing up empty-handed to a Morrison family dinner was social suicide, something I'd learned the hard way during my first visit when Mrs. Morrison had smiled that thin, patronizing smile and asked if I'd forgotten something. The front door opened before I could ring the bell, as if someone had been watching for my arrival. David appeared, looking effortlessly handsome in his crisp white button-down and khakis, his sandy hair perfectly tousled, in that way that screamed expensive haircut. His smile was warm and genuine, the same one that had made me fall for him at that coffee shop near Columbia University 3 years ago. "There's my beautiful girlfriend," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled of his signature cologne and fresh laundry. "You look incredible, Maya." "Thanks," I managed, trying to shake off the nervous energy that always consumed me before these family events. "How's the mood in there?" David's expression flickered for just a moment, a shadow crossing his features. "You know how it is. Mom's been cooking all morning. Dad's already started on the bourbon. And Chelsea," he paused, running a hand through his hair, "Chelsea's been asking when you'll get here for the past hour." Chelsea, David's younger sister, the golden child who could do no wrong in the Morrison family's eyes. At 28, she was everything I wasn't. Blonde, petite, effortlessly charming, and most importantly, born into the right social circle. She worked at her father's investment firm, lived in a penthouse apartment in Manhattan that her parents had bought for her, and had a talent for making me feel like an outsider with just a perfectly timed comment or a sweet, innocent smile. "I'm sure she has," I said, forcing a smile. "Well, let's get this over with." David frowned at my tone. "Maya, they're my family. I know they can be intense sometimes, but they're trying." I bit back the response that was burning on my tongue. 3 years of microaggressions, backhanded compliments, and subtle suggestions that I wasn't quite good enough for their precious son. If this was trying, I'd hate to see them when they weren't making an effort. We walked through the mahogany-paneled foyer, past the oil paintings of stern-faced Morrison ancestors and the fresh flower arrangements that were probably replaced twice a week. The sound of classical music drifted from the living room, mixing with the low murmur of conversation and the clink of expensive glassware. "Maya!" Mrs. Morrison appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a cream-colored cashmere sweater set that probably cost more than my car payment. Her perfectly styled silver hair didn't move as she approached, and her smile was as practiced as a politician's. "How lovely to see you, dear." The hug she gave me was brief and impersonal, the kind reserved for distant acquaintances rather than someone who'd been dating her son for 3 years. I caught a whiff of her perfume, something floral and expensive that seemed to linger in every room of the house. "Mrs. Morrison, thank you for having me," I said, extending the wine bottle. "I brought a Pinot Noir. I hope that's acceptable." She examined the label with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for suspect documents, her perfectly manicured eyebrows raising slightly. "How thoughtful. I'll have Margaret put this away for another time. We're serving a 2018 Burgundy with dinner tonight." Heat crept up my neck as she handed the bottle to the housekeeper, who appeared as if by magic. Another small rejection, another reminder that my choices weren't quite good enough for the Morrison standard. "Maya," Chelsea's voice rang out from the living room, bright and cheerful as always. "Come say hi." I followed the sound of her voice, David's hand warm on the small of my back. The living room was a study in understated elegance, cream-colored walls, antique furniture, and strategically placed art pieces that screamed sophistication. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the Persian rug. Chelsea rose from the leather wingback chair where she'd been perched, a vision in a pale pink dress that hugged her petite frame perfectly. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her blue eyes sparkled with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "Maya, you look gorgeous," she exclaimed, air-kissing both my cheeks in that affected way she'd picked up during her semester abroad in France. "I love what you've done with your hair. It's so bohemian." There it was, the compliment that wasn't quite a compliment, delivered with such sweetness that anyone listening would think she was being kind. But I'd learned to read between the lines of Chelsea speak over the years. Bohemian in her vocabulary meant unprofessional or trying too hard. "Thank you," I replied, matching her bright tone. "You look lovely too. New dress?" "This old thing." She laughed, a tinkling sound like wind chimes. "I picked it up at that little boutique in the village. You know the one, where everything's handmade and ridiculously overpriced, but sometimes you just fall in love with a piece, you know." Another subtle dig. The boutique she was referring to sold dresses that started at $800. I'd walked past it once and felt my bank account weep just looking at the price tags in the window. Mr. Morrison emerged from behind the bar in the corner, a crystal tumbler of what I assumed was his trademark bourbon in hand. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from generations of inherited wealth and social position. "Maya, good to see you," he said, his handshake firm but brief. "Can I fix you a drink? We have that wine you like. What was it? The Sauvignon Blanc from Trader Joe's." My cheeks burned. I'd mentioned liking a particular wine exactly once over a year ago, and somehow it had become my defining characteristic in the Morrison household. Never mind that I'd developed a deeper appreciation for wine since then, or that I'd been trying to expand my palate. In their minds, I was forever the girl who drank cheap wine from the grocery store. "Actually, I'd love to try whatever you're having," I said, gesturing to his bourbon. "It smells wonderful." Surprise flickered across his face, followed by what might have been approval. Well, stepping up to the big leagues, are we? This is a 20-year-old Pappy Van Winkle, not exactly beginner's bourbon. "Dad," David warned, his voice carrying a note of embarrassment. "What? I'm just saying it's got quite a kick to it. Wouldn't want Maya to get overwhelmed." But I was already nodding, determination overriding my better judgment. "I'm sure I can handle it." He shrugged and poured a generous measure into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the firelight. As he handed it to me, I caught Chelsea watching from the corner of my eye, that same sweet smile playing on her lips. "To family," Mr. Morrison said, raising his glass. "To family," we all echoed. I brought the glass to my lips and took what I thought was a conservative sip. The bourbon hit my tongue like liquid fire, burning all the way down my throat and settling in my stomach like molten lava. My eyes watered immediately, and I fought the urge to cough, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing me struggle. "Smooth, isn't it?" Chelsea said, her voice full of innocent concern. "Maybe you should try it with some ice, Maya. It can be quite intense neat." The suggestion was delivered with such apparent kindness that anyone listening would think she was being helpful, but I could see the gleam in her eyes, the barely suppressed amusement at my obvious discomfort. "I'm fine," I managed, my voice only slightly strained. "It's quite good." Mrs. Morrison appeared with a small plate of hors d'oeuvres, delicate canapes topped with what looked like caviar and crème fraîche. "Something to cleanse the palate," she said, offering me the plate first in a rare show of consideration. I selected one of the tiny appetizers, grateful for anything that might cool the fire in my throat. As I bit into it, flavors exploded on my tongue, salty, creamy, with a hint of something I couldn't quite identify. It was delicious and elegant, exactly the kind of sophisticated food that made me feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. "These are incredible, Mrs. Morrison," I said, meaning it. "Did you make them yourself?" She looked genuinely pleased for the first time since I'd arrived. "It's an old family recipe. My grandmother used to serve them at her dinner parties in the Hamptons." Of course they had a history in the Hamptons. I wondered if there was anything in the Morrison family that didn't come with a pedigree and a story about old money elegance. "Mom's an incredible cook," David said, moving closer to me on the sofa. "Wait until you try her beef Wellington tonight. It's legendary." "I'm sure it is," I said, taking another sip of bourbon. It was getting easier to drink, or maybe my taste buds were just going numb. Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Dinner will be served in 15 minutes, Mrs. Morrison." "Wonderful! Maya, would you mind helping me carry some things to the dining room? I could use an extra pair of hands." It was phrased as a request, but I knew better than to refuse. Of course, I followed her through the butler's pantry into the kitchen, a gleaming space of marble countertops and professional-grade appliances. The smell of roasting beef filled the air, along with the aroma of fresh herbs and red wine reduction. "The salad plates need to go out," Mrs. Morrison said, indicating a stack of fine china on the kitchen island. "And the wine glasses. We'll be serving the burgundy I mentioned earlier." I began loading plates onto a serving tray, careful not to chip the delicate china. Each plate was decorated with tiny painted flowers and gold trim that probably made them worth more than my monthly grocery budget. "Maya," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice taking on a more intimate tone, "can I speak frankly with you?" My stomach clenched. Nothing good ever came from conversations that started with that phrase. "Of course." She moved closer, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume again. "I want you to know that David's father and I think you're a lovely girl. You really are." The but was coming. I could feel it hanging in the air like a storm cloud. "But?" I prompted. "But David is at a crucial point in his career. He's being considered for a partnership at the firm, which would set him up for life, the kind of life he's always known, the kind of life he deserves." She paused, arranging some garnish on a platter with surgical precision. "These things, they matter in our world. The right connections, the right social circles, the right presentation." "I see," I said, though I wasn't sure I did, or maybe I understood all too well. "I'm not saying you're not wonderful for him. I'm just wondering if you've thought about whether you're wonderful for his future." The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of trying to fit in, of watching my words and moderating my opinions, of spending money I didn't have on the right clothes and the right wine and the right gifts. 3 years of feeling like I was auditioning for a role in someone else's play. "Mrs. Morrison," I began, but she held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Please, dear, I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to be honest. David loves you. I can see that. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes we have to think about practical matters, about what's best for everyone involved." I stared at the salad plates in my hands, their delicate pattern blurring slightly. Was she right? Was I holding David back? The thought had crossed my mind more than once during our relationship, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, when the weight of all my inadequacies felt overwhelming. "I just want David to be happy," I said quietly. "I know you do. And that's what makes this so difficult." She touched my arm briefly, a gesture that might have seemed comforting to an observer. Just think about what I've said, won't you?" Before I could respond, Chelsea burst through the kitchen door, her face bright with enthusiasm. "Mom, do you need help with anything? Maya, you look a little pale. Are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine," I managed, though I felt anything but fine. "Maybe you should sit down for a minute," Chelsea continued, her voice full of concern. "The bourbon can really sneak up on you if you're not used to it. Here, let me take those plates." She reached for the tray in my hands, and for a moment, we both held it. Her grip seemed to tighten, and I felt the tray wobble slightly. "Careful," she said sweetly, steadying it. "These plates are irreplaceable. They've been in the family for generations." Another reminder of my outsider status, delivered with that trademark smile. "I've got it," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Of course you do," she replied, stepping back with her hands raised in mock surrender. "I'm just trying to help." We carried the dishes to the dining room in silence, the weight of Mrs. Morrison's words settling over me like a heavy blanket. The dining room was as impressive as the rest of the house, a long mahogany table that could easily seat 12, surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in cream-colored silk. Crystal glasses sparkled in the light from the chandelier overhead, and fresh flowers in a silver vase provided the perfect centerpiece. David was already there, adjusting place cards with the careful attention to detail that made him so good at his job. He looked up as we entered, his face brightening. "There are my favorite ladies," he said, coming over to kiss my cheek. "Everything okay? You look a little flushed." "Just warm from helping in the kitchen," I lied, accepting his kiss and drawing strength from his familiar presence. The dinner conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Politics, carefully neutral, current events, thoroughly vetted, and social gossip about people I'd never met but was expected to find fascinating. I contributed when directly addressed, but mostly focused on not making any glaring mistakes, with the elaborate place setting spread before me. The beef Wellington was, as promised, exceptional. Perfectly cooked beef, wrapped in flaky pastry, accompanied by roasted vegetables that had probably been sourced from some exclusive organic farm. Everything about the meal was calculated to impress, from the wine selection to the timing of each course. "Maya, how are things at the school?" Mr. Morrison asked during a lull in conversation. "Still teaching those 8th graders about American history?" "7th grade, actually," I corrected gently. "And yes, it's going well. We're just finishing up our unit on the Civil War." "Such important work," Mrs. Morrison said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but important. "It must be rewarding." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rewarding, but not lucrative. Rewarding, but not prestigious. Rewarding, but not quite good. "Enough for a Morrison." "It is," I said, meeting her gaze steadily. "I love working with kids. There's something magical about watching them discover their passion for learning." "That's beautiful, Maya," Chelsea said, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine admiration. "I've always wondered how you do it. I mean, dealing with all those teenagers every day, it must be exhausting." "It can be challenging," I admitted, "but it's also incredibly fulfilling." "I'm sure it is. Though I imagine the pay isn't exactly substantial." She delivered the question with such innocent curiosity that it almost sounded like genuine interest rather than a subtle dig. Heat crept up my neck. "Teaching isn't about the money." "Of course not," she agreed quickly. "I didn't mean to imply it was. I just think it's so admirable that you're willing to sacrifice financial security for your principles. I'm not sure I'd be that brave." David's jaw tightened. "Chelsea, what? I'm complimenting her." Chelsea's eyes widened with apparent innocence. "I think it's wonderful that Maya follows her heart instead of worrying about things like salary or career advancement. Not everyone can afford to do that." The barb hit its mark perfectly. Not everyone could afford idealism, especially not someone without a trust fund or family money to fall back on. I felt exposed, my financial struggles laid bare at their elegant dinner table. "Maya's job is important," David said firmly. "Teachers shape the future." "Absolutely," Mrs. Morrison agreed, though her smile looked strained. though I suppose at some point practical considerations do become relevant. I knew what she meant. When David and I got married, if we got married, my teacher's salary would seem even more inadequate in their world of country club memberships and summer houses. I'd be the wife who dragged down their son's social standing, the one who couldn't contribute equally to their lifestyle. "More wine, Maya?" Mr. Morrison asked, already reaching for the bottle. I nodded, though I'd barely touched what was already in my glass. The burgundy was excellent, smooth and complex, in a way that made my Trader Joe's selections seem juvenile. As he poured, I caught Chelsea watching me again, that same calculating look in her eyes. "You know what we should do?" she said suddenly, her face lighting up with apparent inspiration. "We should plan a girls' trip, just you and me, Maya. We could go to the Hamptons for a weekend, or maybe that spa in Connecticut that Mom loves so much." The suggestion was so unexpected that I nearly choked on my wine. Chelsea and I had never spent time alone together, unless you counted those few awkward moments in the powder room at various family events. That's very kind of you," I managed. "I'm serious. We never get to really talk, just the two of us. And I feel like I don't know you well enough. David's always going on about how amazing you are, and I want to see what all the fuss is about." She laughed, but there was something sharp in her tone that made me uneasy. The way she said, "all the fuss," made it sound like David's feelings for me were some kind of elaborate joke. "Chelsea, that's a wonderful idea," Mrs. Morrison said, though she didn't look particularly enthusiastic. "It would be nice for you girls to bond." "Oh, Maya might not have time," David interjected, and I could hear the protective note in his voice. "The school year keeps her pretty busy." "Oh, come on," Chelsea said, waving dismissively. "Everyone needs a break sometimes. Besides, I'm sure Maya can take a weekend off from grading papers or whatever." The casual dismissal of my work stung, as if my job were some trivial hobby, rather than a demanding career that required evenings and weekends of preparation and grading. "I'll have to check my schedule," I said diplomatically. "Of course," Chelsea beamed at me. "No pressure, but I really do think it would be fun. We could get to know each other better, share some stories." Her smile turned mysterious. "I have so many stories about David growing up. I bet you'd find them fascinating." Something about the way she said stories sent a chill down my spine. Stories could be innocent reminiscences about childhood adventures, but they could also be carefully chosen anecdotes designed to reveal unflattering truths or create doubt. "I'm sure David was an adorable child," I said carefully. "Oh, he was. But he was also quite the heartbreaker even then." She turned to her brother with an affectionate smile. "Remember that girl in high school? What was her name? Jennifer? You were absolutely devastated when she broke up with you to date that college guy." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Chelsea, what? It's ancient history." She turned back to me, eyes sparkling with mischief. "He locked himself in his room for a week and played sad music at full volume. We thought he might waste away from heartbreak." "Teenage breakups are always dramatic," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "True, but David always did feel things deeply. Remember in college, Mom? That girl from his European history class. What was her name? Amanda. He was convinced she was the one until she transferred schools." I felt David tense beside me, his discomfort palpable. But Mrs. Morrison was nodding along with apparent fondness. "David has always been a romantic," she said. "He falls hard and fast. It's one of his most endearing qualities." Falls hard and fast. The words echoed in my mind. Was that what had happened with me? A pattern of intense but ultimately temporary infatuations. I thought about our relationship, how quickly he'd said he loved me, how effortlessly I'd been swept into his world. Had I just been the latest in a long line of women who'd captured his romantic imagination? "Well, third time's the charm," Chelsea said brightly, raising her wine glass in a mock toast. "Though technically, Maya might be more like fourth, fifth. I've lost count of all your ones, David." The silence that followed was deafening. David's face had gone pale, and Mr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Morrison shot her daughter a sharp look that could have cut glass. "Chelsea," she said, her voice carrying a warning. "What? I'm just teasing." Chelsea's expression was all wide-eyed innocence, but I could see the satisfaction lurking beneath the surface. "Maya knows I'm just being silly, don't you, Maya?" I managed to nod, though my throat felt too tight to speak. The rational part of my mind knew she was trying to get under my skin, to plant seeds of doubt about my relationship with David, but the rational part was being quickly overwhelmed by the emotional part that was already insecure about my place in this family, in David's life. "Maybe we should move to the living room for coffee," Mrs. Morrison suggested, clearly trying to rescue the situation. "Great idea," David said quickly, pushing back his chair. "Maya, would you like to help me clear some of these plates?" I nodded gratefully, eager for any excuse to escape the tension at the table. As I reached for my wine glass to drain the last sip, Chelsea's voice stopped me. "Oh, Maya, wait!" She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I just remembered something I wanted to show you. That article I was telling you about last time, about education reform." I didn't remember her mentioning any article, but I nodded politely. She disappeared toward the kitchen, returning moments later with her phone and a fresh glass of wine. "Here," she said, thrusting the phone toward me. "I bookmarked it for you. I thought you'd find it interesting since you're in the field." And as I took the phone, she somehow managed to bump into me slightly, jostling my arm just as I was reaching for my wine glass. The glass tilted, and a small amount of the burgundy splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh no," Chelsea exclaimed, her voice full of concern. "Maya, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to bump into you like that." Mrs. Morrison's sharp intake of breath was audible. The red wine was already spreading across the expensive fabric, creating an abstract pattern of guilt and embarrassment. "It's fine," I said quickly, though my cheeks were burning. "I'll pay for cleaning or replacement if it can't be cleaned." "Don't be silly," Mrs. Morrison said, though her smile looked strained. "Accidents happen." "I feel terrible," Chelsea continued, dabbing at the stain with her napkin in a way that only seemed to make it worse. "Here, let me get you a fresh glass. You barely got to enjoy that wine." Before I could protest, she was already heading to the sideboard where the wine bottle sat. I watched as she poured a generous amount into a clean glass, the liquid catching the light from the chandelier above. "There we go," she said, returning with the glass and that same bright smile. "Fresh start." I accepted the glass with a quiet thank you, trying to ignore the way Mrs. Morrison was still staring at the stain on her tablecloth. The wine tasted slightly different from what I'd been drinking before. Perhaps it was from a different bottle, or maybe my palate was just affected by stress and embarrassment. "That article is really fascinating," Chelsea continued as if nothing had happened. "It talks about how budget cuts are affecting public schools. I thought you might have some insights." I glanced at her phone, trying to focus on the text despite my rattled nerves. The words seemed to swim slightly on the screen, and I blinked, attributing it to the stress of the evening. It's an important issue," I managed, handing the phone back to her. "I thought you'd think so. You're so passionate about education." Her tone was admiring, but there was something else underneath it, something I couldn't quite identify. David appeared at my elbow, his hand warm and reassuring on my back. "Ready for coffee?" I nodded, grateful for his presence. But as we began moving toward the living room, I felt strangely unsteady, as if the floor had shifted beneath my feet. I paused, gripping the back of my chair for support. "Maya," David's voice sounded concerned. "Are you all right?" "Just a little dizzy," I said, trying to shake off the feeling. "I think I might need some air." "Of course," Mrs. Morrison said, her voice full of polite concern. "Why don't you step out onto the terrace? The fresh air will do you good." And as we moved toward the French doors that led to the back terrace, I caught Chelsea watching me with that same calculating expression. But now there was something else in her eyes, something that looked almost like anticipation. The cool October air hit my face as David led me outside, and I took deep breaths trying to clear my head. The terrace overlooked the perfectly manicured backyard with its ornamental gardens and distant pool house. Security lights cast long shadows across the lawn, creating a landscape that looked more like a movie set than a real home. "Maya, what's wrong?" David asked, his arms around me. "You've been off all evening." "I'm fine," I lied, though I was anything but fine. The dizziness was getting worse, and I felt strangely disconnected from my own body. "Just tired, I think." "You're not just tired," he said, studying my face in the dim light. "Talk to me." But before I could respond, Chelsea's voice drifted through the open door. "Mom, I think Maya might have had a bit too much to drink. She seemed pretty unsteady in there." The words hit me like ice water. Had I had too much to drink? I tried to remember how many glasses of wine I'd consumed, but my memory felt fuzzy and unreliable. The bourbon, then wine at dinner, then that fresh glass Chelsea had brought me. "I don't think I drank that much," I said to David. But even as I said it, doubt crept in. Maybe I had misjudged my tolerance. Maybe the stress of the evening had made the alcohol hit me harder than usual. David frowned, his protective instincts clearly kicking in. "How much did you have?" I'm not sure," I admitted, hating how that sounded. Maybe I should just go home. "Absolutely not. You're not driving like this." His voice was firm, decisive. "We'll call an Uber, or I'll drive you and come back for my car tomorrow." As he pulled out his phone to arrange transportation, I heard Chelsea's voice again, this time speaking to her father. "I feel so bad. I shouldn't have encouraged her to try that bourbon earlier. I knew she wasn't much of a drinker." The comment was delivered with such apparent remorse that anyone listening would think she was genuinely concerned for my well-being. But standing there on the terrace, fighting off waves of dizziness and confusion, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The evening had started badly and only gotten worse. Mrs. Morrison's pointed comments about my suitability for David, Chelsea's subtle digs about my financial situation, the wine stain on the precious tablecloth, it all felt orchestrated somehow, like scenes in a play designed to make me look foolish and inadequate. But as David held me steady and called for a ride home, one thought kept echoing in my mind. The wine Chelsea had brought me had tasted different, just slightly, but enough to notice. Had it been a different bottle, a different vintage, or had it been something else entirely? As we waited for the Uber to arrive, I found myself studying Chelsea through the French doors. She was helping her mother clear the table, moving with the same graceful efficiency she brought to everything else. But there was something in her posture, something satisfied and self-congratulatory that made my stomach clench with more than just nausea. Whatever had happened tonight, I had the unsettling feeling that it had gone exactly according to someone else's plan. I woke up with the kind of headache that felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull while I slept. Pale morning light filtered through the cheap blinds of my studio apartment in Hoboken, highlighting the stark differences between my world and the one I'd escaped from the night before. Where the Morrison house had been all mahogany and marble, my place was IKEA furniture and hand-me-down decorations. Where their walls had been adorned with oil paintings and family portraits, mine displayed student artwork and posters I'd had since college. The contrast had never felt more pronounced than it did in that moment, lying on my lumpy mattress, with my head pounding and my mouth feeling like I'd been chewing cotton. I squinted at my phone on the nightstand. 9:47 a.m. I'd slept for nearly 12 hours, which was unusual for me. Even on weekends, I was typically up by 7, grading papers or planning lessons. Fragments of the previous evening floated back to me like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite assemble. The bourbon that had burned my throat, Mrs. Morrison's pointed comments about David's future, Chelsea's stories about his romantic past, the wine stain on the pristine tablecloth, and underneath it all, that nagging feeling that something hadn't been quite right. My phone buzzed with a text message. "David, hey beautiful, how are you feeling this morning? You were pretty out of it last night. Want me to bring you some coffee and bagels?" I stared at the message, trying to piece together exactly how out of it I'd been. I remembered feeling dizzy on the terrace, remembered David insisting I shouldn't drive, remembered the Uber ride home in fragments, streetlights streaming past the window, David's concerned voice asking if I was okay, the struggle to find my keys in my purse. But there were gaps, fuzzy spaces in my memory that made me uncomfortable. Had I really drunk that much? I'd had the bourbon, yes, but just a sip or two. Wine with dinner, but I'd been careful to pace myself. And then that fresh glass Chelsea had brought me. I sat up slowly, testing my balance. The headache was brutal, but the dizziness from last night seemed to have passed. I made my way to the kitchenette and drank a large glass of water, trying to rehydrate and clear my head. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was not encouraging. My carefully styled hair from last night was a tangled mess. My makeup had smudged under my eyes, creating dark circles that made me look like I'd been in a fight, and my skin had a grayish pallor that suggested I'd been through some kind of ordeal. This wasn't what a normal hangover looked like for me. I'd been drunk before, what college student hadn't? But this felt different, more intense, more disorienting, like my body had processed something it wasn't familiar with. I texted David back, feeling rough. Coffee sounds amazing. Give me an hour to shower and become human again. His response was immediate. On my way. I'll stop at that place you like on Washington Street. The shower helped, hot water washing away the remnants of last night and some of the fog in my head. As I stood under the spray, I tried to reconstruct the evening more clearly. The dinner conversation, Chelsea's pointed comments about David's romantic history, the wine spill, and then that moment when Chelsea had brought me a fresh glass. A memory surfaced, clearer now. The wine had tasted different. Not dramatically different, but enough that I'd noticed. At the time, I'd attributed it to stress, or perhaps a different bottle. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and a clearer head, the timing seemed suspicious. Chelsea had spilled my wine, or rather had accidentally bumped into me while I was reaching for it. Then she'd immediately offered to get me a fresh glass, disappearing for several minutes before returning with what she claimed was the same wine. But it had tasted different, slightly bitter with an aftertaste that hadn't been present in the original pour. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the paranoid thoughts creeping in. This was Chelsea Morrison, David's sister. Privileged and sometimes catty, yes, but not someone who would actually tamper with someone's drink. That was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real-life suburban dinner parties. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together. Chelsea's calculating looks throughout the evening, her satisfaction when I'd started feeling unsteady, her quick comment to her parents about my apparent intoxication. It had all felt orchestrated, like a performance designed to make me look bad. The sound of my apartment buzzer interrupted my spiraling thoughts. David. I threw on jeans and a sweater, running my fingers through my damp hair in a futile attempt to look presentable. When I opened the door, David was standing there with 2 large coffees and a bag from Goldberg's Bagels, concern written across his handsome features. You look terrible, he said, which was probably the most honest thing anyone had said to me in the past 24 hours. Thanks. That's exactly what every woman wants to hear first thing in the morning. He had the grace to look sheepish. I didn't mean it like that. I meant you look like you feel terrible, which makes sense, considering. Considering what exactly? I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. The first sip was like a lifeline, hot and caffeinated and blessedly familiar. David set the bagels on my small dining table and studied my face. Maya, you were really drunk last night. More drunk than I've ever seen you. I was worried. The words stung, even though he delivered them with obvious concern rather than judgment. I don't understand it. I didn't feel like I'd had that much to drink. Alcohol affects people differently on different days, he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as me. Maybe you hadn't eaten enough earlier in the day, or you were stressed, or what? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as his tell when he was uncomfortable. Maya, I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me. My stomach clenched. Okay. Have you been drinking more lately? I mean, when you're not with me? Because last night, the way you reacted to the alcohol, it seemed like maybe you had a tolerance built up, or maybe you'd been drinking before you got there. The accusation hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands, staring at him in disbelief. Are you asking me if I'm an alcoholic, David? I'm not. I'm just trying to understand what happened. My parents were really concerned, and Chelsea mentioned that you seemed off from the moment you arrived. Chelsea mentioned. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. And what exactly did Chelsea mention? David shifted uncomfortably. She said you seemed nervous when you got there, like you'd been drinking to calm your nerves. And then when you had that bourbon with my dad, she noticed you handled it pretty well for someone who claims not to drink much hard liquor. I felt like I'd been slapped. Claims not to drink much? David, you've been dating me for 3 years. Have you ever seen me drunk? Have you ever seen me drink excessively? No, but what? But your sister makes some observations and suddenly you're questioning everything you know about me? That's not fair, Maya. I'm worried about you. Last night was scary. You could barely stand up when we left. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the truth was that I didn't remember much about leaving. The end of the evening was a blur of concern and car rides, and David helping me to my door. I don't know what happened last night, I said finally, but I can tell you with absolute certainty that I am not an alcoholic, and I did not pre-game your parents' dinner party. David's expression softened slightly. Then what do you think happened? I opened my mouth to voice my suspicions about Chelsea, but the words died in my throat. How could I tell him that I thought his beloved sister had drugged me? It sounded paranoid and vindictive, exactly the kind of accusation a jealous girlfriend would make when trying to deflect blame. I don't know, I said instead. Maybe I was more stressed than I realized. Maybe the alcohol hit me harder because I was upset. Upset about what? Now it was my turn to run my hands through my hair. Where did I even start? Your mother basically told me I'm not good enough for you. Your sister spent the entire evening making subtle digs about my background and financial situation. Your family treats me like an interloper who's temporarily occupying space in your life until someone more suitable comes along. Your mum and I had a conversation in the kitchen, I said finally. She made it clear that she doesn't think I'm right for you. David's face darkened. What did she say? Nothing direct. She's too polished for that. But she made her position clear. I took another sip of coffee, trying to organize my thoughts. She talked about your career, about how you're being considered for partnership, about the importance of the right connections and social circles. Maya, she asked if I'd thought about whether I was wonderful for your future. The words still stung to repeat. She was very careful to frame it as concern for your career advancement, but the message was pretty clear. David was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. I'm sorry she said that to you. Are you? Or do you think she has a point? The question hung between us, heavier than I'd intended it to be. David looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes. Doubt? Consideration? Whatever it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Of course I don't think she has a point, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maya, I love you. My career, my family's expectations, none of that matters more than how I feel about you. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to fall into his arms and let his reassurances wash away all the doubts and insecurities that had been planted the night before. But something held me back. Does it though? I asked quietly. David, be honest with me. When you think about our future, about marriage and kids and building a life together, do you ever worry about how I'll fit into your world? Another long pause, another flicker of something across his features. Sometimes, he admitted, and the honesty was both devastating and refreshing. Not because I don't love you, but because I know how difficult my family can be. I know they have expectations, and I know they can make life hell for people who don't meet those expectations. So your solution is what? For me to change, to become someone more like Chelsea? No, That's not what I'm saying at all. I love who you are, Maya. I love your passion for teaching, your principles, the way you care about your students. I don't want you to change, but you want your family to accept me. Yes, is that so wrong? I didn't have a good answer for that. Of course I wanted his family to accept me. Of course I wanted to fit seamlessly into his world. But at what cost? Tell me about Chelsea, I said, changing the subject slightly. David looked surprised by the shift. What about her? You two seem close. We are. She's my little sister. I've always looked out for her, even when she's manipulative. His expression hardened. Maya, that's not fair. Chelsea can be intense sometimes, but she's not manipulative. Last night she told stories about your romantic history. She made sure to mention how you've had multiple serious relationships, how you always think each girl is the one until you don't anymore. She was just teasing, was she? Because it felt pretty calculated to me, like she was trying to plant seeds of doubt about the stability of our relationship. David set down his coffee and looked at me with growing frustration. Maya, I understand that last night was difficult, and I get that you're feeling defensive, but you're reading malicious intent into innocent comments. Chelsea was just being her usual chatty self. And the wine spill, that was just an accident too? Of course it was an accident. Why would she deliberately spill wine on my mother's tablecloth? She didn't spill it. She bumped into me while I was reaching for my glass, which caused me to spill it. Then she immediately offered to get me a fresh glass of wine, because she felt bad about causing the accident. David, the wine she brought me tasted different. The words were out before I could stop them, and David stared at me like I'd just announced I believed in alien abduction. Different how? Just different. Bitter. Like something had been added to it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see David processing my words, and I could see the exact moment when he decided I was being paranoid. Maya, do you hear yourself right now? You're suggesting that my sister drugged you at a family dinner. I'm not suggesting anything, I'm just telling you what I experienced. You experienced getting drunk at my parents' house, and now you're looking for someone to blame instead of taking responsibility. His words hit me like physical blows. After 3 years together, after everything we'd shared, he was choosing to believe the worst about me, rather than consider that his precious sister might not be the angel he thought she was. Get out, I said quietly. Maya, get out, David, right now. He stood up slowly, his face a mixture of anger and hurt. Fine, but when you're ready to have an adult conversation about this, let me know. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone with my thoughts and my doubts and the growing certainty that something had been very wrong about the previous evening. I spent the rest of the day researching. What I found made my blood run cold. Rohypnol, GHB, ketamine, all drugs that could be slipped into someone's drink, all drugs that could cause confusion, dizziness, memory loss, and an inability to function normally. All drugs that would metabolize quickly, leaving little trace in someone's system by the next day. The symptoms fit, the memory gaps, the intense reaction to what should have been a manageable amount of alcohol, the way I'd felt disconnected from my own body. Even the bitter aftertaste I'd noticed could be explained by some of these substances, but proving it would be nearly impossible. The drugs would be out of my system by now, and even if they weren't, who would believe me? I was the outsider making accusations against the golden daughter of a respected family. As the afternoon wore on, my phone buzzed with messages from David, each one more conciliatory than the last. Maya, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said those things. Can we talk? I hate fighting with you. I love you. Please don't shut me out. I ignored them all. I was done being the understanding girlfriend who always gave everyone the benefit of the doubt. I was done being the one who apologized for other people's bad behavior. If Chelsea Morrison wanted to play games, I could play games too. But first, I needed proof. 3 days passed before I finally responded to David's messages. 3 days of radio silence while I planned my next move and researched everything I could about the Morrison family. What I found was illuminating. Chelsea Morrison, despite her sweet demeanor and designer clothes, had a history. Nothing criminal, nothing that would show up in a background check, but a pattern of behavior that became clear once you knew where to look. Social media was a goldmine. Her Instagram was full of carefully curated photos showing her perfect life, charity galas, weekend trips to the Hamptons, dinner parties with beautiful people. But dig deeper into the comments and tagged photos from friends, and a different picture emerged. Sarah Chen, a former colleague from Chelsea's brief stint at a non-profit before joining her father's firm, had posted a photo from a work retreat 2 years ago. Chelsea was in the background, and Sarah had tagged her with the comment, "Remember when you convinced everyone that Jessica was stealing from petty cash? Good times." The comment had been deleted, but screenshots lived forever on gossip forums where former non-profit employees discussed their experiences. According to those threads, Jessica had been fired based on Chelsea's evidence, only to be vindicated months later when the real thief was caught. By then, Jessica's reputation was ruined, and Chelsea had already moved on to her father's company. There were other incidents. A college roommate who'd mysteriously ended up accused of academic dishonesty after a falling out with Chelsea. A friend from prep school whose boyfriend had suddenly developed concerns about her drinking problem after she'd crossed Chelsea somehow. Always plausible, always just subtle enough to maintain deniability, and always devastating to the victim. Chelsea Morrison was very good at destroying people while keeping her own hands clean. I finally texted David back on Wednesday evening, "I'm ready to talk, but I want to see Chelsea first." His response was immediate. "Maya, I don't think that's a good idea. You're both upset and—" "I'm not upset, David. I'm determined. If you want to salvage our relationship, you'll arrange for me to spend some time alone with your sister." "Why?" "Because I want to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I misunderstood what happened at dinner. Maybe we can clear the air." It wasn't entirely a lie. I did want to clear the air. I just intended to do it in a way that David wasn't expecting. "Okay, she mentioned wanting to do that girls' trip. Maybe you two could grab coffee or something more low-key?" "Perfect. Ask her to meet me Saturday afternoon, somewhere public." We settled on a coffee shop in the village, neutral territory where Chelsea would feel comfortable and I would have witnesses. Not that I expected violence, but I'd learned not to underestimate what desperate people might do when cornered. Saturday arrived grey and drizzling, typical October weather in New York. I dressed carefully in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater, professional but not trying too hard. I wanted to look like someone who had gotten her life together, not someone spiraling into paranoid accusations. The coffee shop was busy but not packed, filled with the usual mix of students, freelancers, and weekend warriors trying to caffeinate their way through their to-do lists. I chose a table near the window where I could see the street, arriving 15 minutes early to observe and prepare. Chelsea walked in exactly on time, because of course she did. She looked effortlessly put together in dark, skinny jeans, tall boots, and a camel-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out despite the rain, and she carried a designer handbag that I recognized from a magazine spread about investment pieces. She spotted me immediately and waved, her smile as bright and practiced as always. "Maya!" she exclaimed, sliding into the seat across from me. "You look wonderful! I was so worried after last weekend." "Were you?" I asked, accepting the brief hug she offered across the small table. "Of course I was. You seemed so unwell." "I felt terrible that you had such a bad time at Mom and Dad's." She was good, I had to give her that. The concern sounded genuine, and her body language was open and friendly. If I hadn't spent the week researching her history and analyzing her behavior patterns, I might have been fooled. "Let me get us some coffee," she continued, already standing. "What would you like? Something simple, or are you feeling adventurous?" The question seemed innocent enough, but given my suspicions, it felt loaded with meaning. "Just a regular coffee, black," I said. "I'll come with you." "Don't be silly. I've got it." She was already walking toward the counter before I could protest. I watched her place the order, chatting easily with the barista like she was everyone's best friend. She had that gift that some people possessed, the ability to make strangers feel instantly comfortable and welcomed. It was probably part of what made her so effective at what I was beginning to suspect was a hobby of hers, manipulation disguised as kindness. She returned with 2 large coffees and a plate of pastries, sliding back into her seat with that same bright smile. "I got some of those almond croissants you mentioned liking," she said, pushing the plate toward me. I didn't remember mentioning liking almond croissants to Chelsea, but I nodded my thanks and took a tentative sip of my coffee. It tasted normal, rich, slightly bitter, exactly what I'd expected from a decent coffee shop. "So," Chelsea said, settling back in her chair, "David said you wanted to talk. I'm glad. I feel like we got off on the wrong foot last weekend, and I hate that." "Do you?" "Hate it, I mean." She looked surprised by the directness of my question. "Of course I do. Maya, you're important to David, which makes you important to me. I want us to be friends, even though you think I'm wrong for him." The mask slipped, just for a second. I saw something flicker in her eyes, surprise that I was being so direct. Calculation as she figured out how to respond, and underneath it all, something that looked almost like excitement. "I don't think you're wrong for him," she said carefully. "I think you're different from the girls he usually dates." "Different how?" She took a sip of her coffee, buying time. "Well, you're more serious for one thing, more focused on your career. David's used to women who are more flexible in their priorities." "You mean women who don't have careers that matter to them?" "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." We stared at each other across the small table, the pretense of friendly conversation evaporating. Chelsea was the first to look away, her fingers fidgeting with her coffee cup. "Maya, I don't know what you want me to say. Yes, David has dated women who were more willing to prioritize his needs and his schedule, women who understood that being with someone in his position requires certain accommodations, like giving up your own ambitions, like being practical about what matters most in a relationship." I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Getting emotional wouldn't help me get what I came for. "Tell me about Jennifer," I said. Chelsea blinked, clearly not expecting the change of subject. "Jennifer, the high school girlfriend, the one you mentioned at dinner. You said David was devastated when she broke up with him. That was a long time ago. Why would you want to know about ancient history?" "Because you brought it up. You made a point of telling me about all his previous relationships, all the women he thought were the one, until he didn't anymore." Chelsea's laugh was light and dismissive. "Maya, I was just teasing him. You know how siblings are." "Actually, I don't. I'm an only child." I leaned forward slightly. "But I'm learning a lot about family dynamics lately." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I think you were trying to make me insecure about my relationship with David. I think you wanted me to doubt his feelings for me, to worry that I was just another temporary infatuation." Chelsea's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. "That's quite an accusation." "Is it? Because it worked, at least temporarily. After dinner, I did start wondering if David's feelings for me were as serious as I thought. Maybe that says more about your own insecurities than it does about my intentions." The comment was delivered with surgical precision, designed to make me question myself rather than her motives. But I'd been expecting it. "Maybe it does," I agreed. "Or maybe you're very good at identifying and exploiting other people's vulnerabilities." Silence fell between us, heavy with unspoken accusations. Chelsea took another sip of her coffee, her movements careful and controlled. "Maya, I think you're overthinking things. Family dinners can be stressful, especially when you're not used to them. Add some alcohol to the mix, and it's understandable that you might have misinterpreted some innocent comments." "About that," I said, pulling my phone from my purse. "I've been doing some research about what happened to me that night." "Research?" I opened my browser to an article about drink spiking and turned the screen toward her. "Did you know that there are drugs that can be slipped into someone's drink that cause confusion, dizziness, and memory loss? Drugs that are colorless and nearly tasteless." Chelsea glanced at the screen, then back at my face. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I caught a slight tension around her eyes. Maya, what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, I'm stating facts. The symptoms I experienced that night are consistent with drink tampering. That's ridiculous. You were at my parents' house, not some seedy bar. Actually, studies show that drink spiking is more common at private parties and social gatherings than at bars. People feel safer, let their guard down more. Chelsea set down her coffee cup with enough force to make the liquid slosh. Are you seriously accusing someone in my family of drugging you? I'm saying that the wine you brought me tasted different from what I'd been drinking earlier. Of course it tasted different. It was from a different bottle. We opened a new one after you spilled on the tablecloth. Did you? Open a new bottle, I mean, because I didn't see you do that when you went to get me a fresh glass. There were several bottles already open. I just poured from one of those. It was a reasonable explanation, but something in her tone suggested she was improvising. Chelsea, can I ask you something? Apparently you're going to regardless of my answer. Why don't you like me? The question seemed to catch her off guard. She opened her mouth, then closed it as if deciding how much honesty to risk. I don't dislike you, Maya. That's not the same thing. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the rain-streaked window at the people hurrying past on the sidewalk. You want the truth? She said finally. That would be refreshing. I think you're going to hurt my brother. How? By being exactly who you are. She turned back to me, and for the first time since I'd known her, her expression was completely unguarded. David is a romantic, Maya. He falls hard and fast, and he convinces himself that love is enough to overcome any obstacle. And you don't think it is. I think love without compatibility is a recipe for disaster. I think David is so taken with the idea of you, the idealistic teacher, the woman with principles, the breath of fresh air from outside our stuffy social circle, that he's ignoring all the practical reasons why it won't work, such as the fact that you'll never be happy in his world, and he'll never be happy giving up his world for yours. Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost kind. You think we're all shallow and materialistic? You judge us for caring about things like social status and financial security, and maybe you're right to judge us, but that's who we are, Maya. That's the family David comes from, and it's shaped who he is, whether you want to admit it or not. So you decided to help speed up the inevitable breakup? I decided to let you see what you were really getting into. If you can't handle one dinner party where people are polite but not particularly warm, how are you going to handle years of charity galas and business dinners and social events where you're always going to be the outsider? By drugging me? Chelsea laughed, but there was no humor in it. Maya, you got drunk. It happens. The fact that you're sitting here accusing me of criminal behavior instead of taking responsibility for your own poor judgment just proves my point about your character. My character. You're so determined to be the victim, so convinced that everyone is against you, that you can't admit when you've made a mistake. Do you think that's the kind of partner David needs? Someone who creates drama and paranoia instead of supporting him? The words stung because there was just enough truth in them to make me doubt myself. Had I been looking for someone to blame? Had I let my insecurities about fitting into David's world make me paranoid and vindictive? But then I remembered the research I'd done about Chelsea's history, the pattern of behavior that stretched back years. You're very good at this, I said quietly. At what? At making people doubt themselves, at taking their legitimate concerns and twisting them into character flaws, at destroying people while maintaining plausible deniability. Chelsea's face went very still. I have no idea what you're talking about. Sarah Chen, Jessica Martinez, Amanda Hartwell from your prep school. I watched her face as I recited the names. Should I go on? The color drained from her cheeks, but she recovered quickly. I don't know what gossip you've been reading online, but it's not gossip when there's a pattern. 3 different women, 3 different situations, but the same result every time. Their reputations destroyed, their lives disrupted, while you walked away looking innocent. Chelsea stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Several other patrons looked in our direction, but she seemed oblivious to the attention. "This conversation is over," she said, reaching for her purse. "Is it? Because I think we're just getting started." She paused, something in my tone making her look back at me. "See, Chelsea, I did my homework on you. And what I learned is that you're very good at playing the long game, at subtle manipulation and psychological warfare. But you made one mistake last weekend." "What mistake?" I smiled, and I made sure it was as bright and practiced as one of hers. "You underestimated me." Before she could respond, I pulled a small digital recorder from my purse and placed it on the table between us. "You see, this entire conversation has been recorded, including the part where you basically admitted to orchestrating what happened at dinner and where you revealed your true feelings about me and your brother." Chelsea stared at the recorder like it was a snake. "You can't. That's illegal. Recording someone without their consent." Actually, New York is a one-party consent state. As long as one person in the conversation knows it's being recorded, which I did, it's perfectly legal. She sank back into her chair, her composure finally cracking. "What do you want?" "I want you to stay away from me. I want you to stop interfering in my relationship with David, and I want you to think very carefully about your behavior going forward. And if I don't, then I start sharing what I've learned about your history. Starting with David, then moving on to your parents, then perhaps the partners at your father's firm. I imagine they'd be very interested to know about their newest employee's tendency toward workplace sabotage." Chelsea's hands were shaking now, though she tried to hide it by clasping them together on the table. "You can't prove anything about last weekend," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe not, but I don't need to prove it. I just need to plant seeds of doubt, make people start paying closer attention to your behavior. Amazing how patterns become visible once people know to look for them." I stood up, leaving the recorder on the table between us. "Keep that," I said. "Consider it a reminder of our conversation." As I walked toward the door, I heard her call after me. "Maya!" I turned back, expecting anger or threats or pleading. Instead, she was smiling. Not her practiced social smile, but something genuine and almost impressed. "You know," she said, "maybe I underestimated you after all." "Yes," I replied. "You did." The rain had stopped by the time I reached the street, and for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe properly. I'd played Chelsea's game and won, but more importantly, I'd proven something to myself. I was stronger than I'd thought, and I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel small ever again. But as I walked home through the village streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Chelsea Morrison didn't seem like the kind of person who accepted defeat gracefully. If anything, I'd probably just made myself a very dangerous enemy. The fallout began exactly 48 hours after my coffee meeting with Chelsea, which told me everything I needed to know about her planning style. The girl didn't do anything impulsively. I was in my 7th grade classroom on Monday morning, writing the day's objectives on the whiteboard, when my phone buzzed with a text from David. "We need to talk. Tonight. This has gone too far." The tone was different from his usual messages, colder, more formal. It sounded like someone else entirely, which probably meant Chelsea had gotten to him first with her version of events. I finished writing the lesson plan and checked my other messages. 3 missed calls from my school's principal, Dr. Rodriguez, and a voicemail asking me to see her during my lunch period. A text from my department head about needing to discuss some concerns that have been brought to the administration's attention. My stomach dropped. Chelsea was moving fast and hitting hard, just like she had with her previous targets. The morning dragged by in a haze of anxiety. My students sensed something was wrong. Kids always do, and their usual energy was subdued. During 3rd period, I caught Destiny Martinez, one of my brightest students, passing a note that said, "Ms. Rodriguez looks stressed today." Even 12-year-olds could see I was falling apart. Lunch couldn't come fast enough. I made my way to Dr. Rodriguez's office, mentally preparing for whatever bomb Chelsea had managed to detonate in my professional life. Dr. Rodriguez was a fair woman in her 50s who had always been supportive of my teaching methods and classroom management. But when I knocked on her open door, her expression was carefully neutral in a way that made my chest tighten. "Maya, please come in and close the door," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. I sat down, folding my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking. "I received a concerning phone call this morning," she began, her voice carefully professional. "Someone reached out with allegations about your conduct outside of school." "What kind of allegations?" "They claimed that you've been struggling with alcohol abuse and that your behavior at recent social events has been problematic." The room felt like it was spinning. "Dr. Rodriguez, I can assure you that—" She held up a hand. "Maya, I've known you for 3 years. You're one of our most dedicated teachers, and I've never seen any signs of substance abuse. But I'm required to take all reports seriously, especially when they come with documentation." "Documentation?" Dr. Rodriguez turned her computer screen toward me. On it was an email with several attached photos. I recognized them immediately. Pictures from the Morrison dinner party. Someone had captured me looking unsteady on the terrace, David's arm around me, for support. Another showed me in the Uber, my head lolling against the window. In isolation, the photos told a clear story of someone who was heavily intoxicated. They didn't show the hours of subtle torment that had preceded my condition, or the suspicious circumstances around my drink being replaced. These photos were sent anonymously, along with a detailed account of your behavior at what was described as a family dinner. Dr. Rodriguez's voice was gentle but firm. The sender claimed to be concerned about your welfare and felt obligated to notify your employer. "Dr. Rodriguez, I can explain." "Maya, I need you to understand that I'm not making any judgments here. If you're struggling with something, we want to help you get the support you need, but I have to ask, is there any truth to these allegations?" I stared at the photos on her screen, seeing myself through Chelsea's carefully orchestrated lens. Drunk, unstable, unprofessional. Everything a dedicated teacher shouldn't be. "There's more to the story than what those pictures show," I said finally. "I'm listening." And so I told her. Everything, the dinner party dynamics, Mrs. Morrison's kitchen conversation, Chelsea's pointed comments, the wine spill and replacement drink, the suspicious taste, and my subsequent research into drink tampering. I told her about Chelsea's history with other women, about the pattern of behavior I'd uncovered, about the recorded conversation, where Chelsea had essentially admitted to orchestrating my humiliation. Dr. Rodriguez listened without interruption, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Maya," she said finally, "these are very serious accusations you're making. I know how it sounds. I know it seems paranoid and vindictive, but I swear to you, everything I've told you is the truth." Do you have any proof? The recording you mentioned?" I pulled out my phone and played the relevant portions of Saturday's conversation. Dr. Rodriguez listened with growing alarm as Chelsea's voice filled the office, cold and calculating as she described her true feelings about my relationship with David. "This is disturbing," Dr. Rodriguez said when the recording ended. "But it doesn't necessarily prove that she drugged you at the dinner party." "No, it doesn't. But it proves that she's capable of elaborate psychological manipulation, and it establishes a pattern of behavior." Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Maya, I want to be clear about something. Based on what I know of your character and your work here, I don't believe you have a drinking problem, but I am concerned about the situation you've described. What happens now? Now we document everything. I'm going to file a report about this conversation, including the recording you've shared. If this person, Chelsea, contacts the school again, we'll be prepared with context." Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a new wave of anxiety. "What about David? That's not a school matter, Maya. But if I were you, I'd think very carefully about whether this is a relationship worth fighting for." Her words echoed in my mind as I returned to my classroom for the afternoon. My students were restless, picking up on the tension that seemed to follow me like a dark cloud. During 7th period, I found myself staring out the window instead of focusing on the lesson, watching the autumn leaves fall and wondering how everything had gotten so complicated. My phone buzzed with another message from David. "Maya, Chelsea told me about your conversation on Saturday. We really need to talk." I typed and deleted several responses before settling on "your place, 7 p.m. The rest of the day crawled by. By the time I pulled into David's apartment complex in Midtown, the sun was setting and my nerves were frayed beyond repair. David lived in one of those sleek, high-rise buildings that catered to young professionals, all glass and steel and modern amenities that cost a fortune. His apartment was on the 23rd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of Manhattan. It was decorated in shades of grey and white, minimalist and expensive, the kind of place that looked more like a showroom than a home. David was pacing by the windows when I arrived, his usually perfect hair disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it. He turned when I entered, and I was struck by how tired he looked. "Maya," he said, and there was something in his voice. Relief? Disappointment? I couldn't tell. "Hi." We stood there for a moment, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us like a wall. "Sit down," he said finally, gesturing to his expensive leather sofa. "Please." I remained standing. "What did Chelsea tell you?" David ran his hand through his hair again, a gesture that had become more frequent as our relationship hit rougher waters. "She told me about Saturday, about your accusations, about the recording, about the threats you made." "Threats?" "She said you threatened to destroy her reputation if she didn't stay away from you. I told her to stop interfering in our relationship. I wouldn't call that a threat. You recorded a private conversation without her knowledge and then used it to coerce her behavior. What would you call it?" The conversation was already going sideways, and we'd barely started. David's tone was defensive, protective of his sister in a way that made my chest ache. "I would call it protecting myself from someone who has a documented history of destroying other women." "Documented?" David's laugh was bitter. "Maya, you found some gossip on social media and convinced yourself it was evidence of a conspiracy." "It wasn't gossip, David. It was a pattern. Sarah Chen, Jessica Martinez, Amanda Hartwell." "Stop!" His voice was sharp enough to cut. "Just stop, Maya. Do you hear yourself? You're obsessing over strangers' social media posts, creating elaborate theories about my sister's supposed crimes, recording conversations like some kind of private investigator. This isn't healthy." The words hit me like physical blows. "So you think I'm crazy? I think you're spiraling. I think you got embarrassed about drinking too much at my parents' house, and instead of just accepting it and moving on, you've created this whole narrative where you're the victim of some elaborate plot." "I did not drink too much, David. I was drugged by my sister at my parents' house during a family dinner." He said it like the location made the idea inherently absurd. "Yes." "Maya, do you understand how that sounds? You're accusing Chelsea of committing a felony. You're suggesting that she carries around date rape drugs just in case she needs to slip them into someone's wine. I'm suggesting that she's a calculated, manipulative person who saw me as a threat to her family's status quo and took steps to eliminate that threat." David stared at me for a long moment, and I watched as something died in his eyes. The last vestige of benefit of the doubt, maybe, or the final thread of whatever had bound us together for 3 years. "Maya, I can't do this anymore." The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they hit me with the force of a sledgehammer. "Can't do what?" "This. Us. Whatever this has become." He gestured vaguely at the space between us. "You've accused my family of crimes, threatened my sister, and turned what should have been a simple misunderstanding into some kind of war. It was never simple, David. Your family has never accepted me, and you've never stood up for me. I've defended you constantly. No, you've made excuses for them. There's a difference. Maya, my family isn't perfect, but they're not villains. They're just particular about who they welcome into their circle. Particular." That's a nice way of saying elitist and exclusionary. And you're so perfect, you've never judged them for having money, for caring about social connections, for living differently than you do? He had me there, and we both knew it. I had judged them, had looked down on their priorities and their lifestyle, but that didn't excuse their behavior toward me. I judged them for treating me like I wasn't good enough for you, I said quietly. And maybe you're not. The words hung in the air between us, brutal in their honesty. David's face went pale as soon as he said them, as if he couldn't believe they'd come out of his mouth. I didn't mean... Yes, you did. I felt strangely calm, like the other shoe had finally dropped. You meant it, David. Maybe not the way it sounded, but you meant the sentiment behind it. Maya, no, it's okay. It's actually a relief to hear you say it out loud. I picked up my purse from where I'd dropped it on his coffee table. Your mother was right. Love isn't always enough. Don't go like this. We can work through this. Can we? Because it seems like you've already chosen your side. David's silence was answer enough. I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. For what it's worth, David, I did love you. The real you, not some idealized version. I loved your curiosity about the world, your dry sense of humor, the way you genuinely cared about social justice issues, even though they didn't directly affect you. Maya. But I can't love someone who won't fight for me, and I can't be with someone who thinks his family's approval is more important than my well-being. I left him standing there in his pristine apartment with its million-dollar view, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The elevator ride down seemed to last forever, giving me time to process what had just happened. 3 years of my life gone. 3 years of trying to fit into a world that had never wanted me, trying to change myself for someone who ultimately wasn't willing to change for me. My phone buzzed as I reached the lobby. A text from an unknown number. I hear congratulations are in order. See. Chelsea had probably been waiting for news of the breakup, maybe even listening outside David's apartment door. The thought should have made me angry, but instead it made me smile. I typed back, "Thank you. You did me a favor." Her response was immediate. "How's that? You showed me who I really am. Someone who won't be intimidated, who won't be made to feel small, who won't accept crumbs from people who think they're better than me. So thank you, Chelsea, for teaching me that I deserve better." I didn't wait for her response. Instead, I blocked her number, deleted David's contact information, and walked out into the cool October evening. The city stretched out before me, full of possibility and promise. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to worry about fitting into someone else's expectations or measuring up to standards that were designed to exclude me. I was free. 3 months later, I was having coffee with my colleague Rachel when she pointed to a gossip item in the society pages of the New York Post. "Isn't that your ex-boyfriend?" she asked, sliding the paper across the table. I looked at the photo. David and a blonde woman at some charity gala, looking perfectly matched in their formal wear and practiced smiles. The caption identified her as socialite Madison Ashworth, daughter of prominent investment banker Charles Ashworth. "Yep, that's him," I said, handing the paper back without a second glance. "Are you okay?" "I'm great," I said, and realized I meant it. "She looks like she'll fit right in." That evening, I was grading papers in my apartment when my buzzer rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and it was past 8 o'clock on a school night. "Maya, it's Chelsea." I stared at the intercom for a moment, debating whether to ignore her completely, but curiosity won out. "What do you want, Chelsea?" "To talk. Just for a minute." Against my better judgment, I buzzed her up. She looked different when I opened the door, smaller somehow, less polished. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of her usual professional style, and she was wearing jeans and a plain sweater. "Thank you for letting me come up," she said. "Make it quick." I wanted to apologize. The words were so unexpected that I almost didn't process them. Apologize for what I did to you. At the dinner party, afterwards with your school, all of it. She took a shaky breath. "You were right. About everything." I leaned against my doorframe, not inviting her in, but not closing the door either. "Why now?" Because I've had 3 months to think about what you said, about patterns, about the way I treat people, about who I really am. She looked down at her hands. You weren't the first person to call me out on my behavior, Maya. You were just the first person I couldn't dismiss or destroy. So this is what? A moment of personal growth? This is me trying to figure out how to live with myself. She looked up at me, and I was surprised to see genuine distress in her eyes. I did drug your wine that night. I had a prescription for anxiety medication, and I crushed up a few pills and stirred them into your drink when I went to get you a fresh glass. The admission hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd known it was true. Why? Because I was scared. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Because David had never been as serious about anyone as he was about you. And I was terrified that you were going to take him away from us. From us or from you? Chelsea was quiet for a long moment. From me, she admitted. David and I, we've always been close. Maybe too close. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't. It was just that he was the only person in our family who ever really listened to me, who ever made me feel like I mattered for who I was instead of what I represented. So you decided to eliminate the competition. I decided to show you what you'd be up against if you stayed with him. I thought if I could make you see how impossible it would be to fit into our world, you'd leave on your own and David wouldn't hate me for driving you away. Instead, you just delayed the inevitable and made me suffer in the process. Yes, she looked up at me again, tears in her eyes. Maya, I am so sorry. What I did to you was unforgivable. It was criminal. And it wasn't even necessary because you and David would never have worked anyway. How do you figure that? Because David will never choose love over family approval. He talks a good game about being independent and following his heart, but when push comes to shove, he'll always take the path of least resistance. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You deserved someone who would fight for you. David isn't that person. I stared at her. This woman who had orchestrated my humiliation and nearly destroyed my career, and felt something unexpected. Pity. Chelsea, why are you really here? Because I wanted you to know that you won. Not just against me, but in general. You stood up for yourself when no one else would. You refused to be made small. You fought back. She managed a watery smile. I've never been able to do that. You could learn. Maybe. I'm seeing someone, a therapist, trying to figure out why I am the way I am, why I hurt people instead of dealing with my own problems. That's good. Is it weird that I'm proud of you for not letting us break you? A little weird, yeah. She laughed, a real laugh this time instead of her practiced tinkle. I should go. I wanted you to know that you were right about everything, and I'm sorry it took me so long to admit it. She turned to leave, then paused at the elevator. Maya, for what it's worth, I think you're exactly the kind of person David needs. He's just not brave enough to see it. But you are. I'm learning to be. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment thinking about families and loyalty and the difference between love and possession. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. Drinks tomorrow? I have news about the new science teacher. I smiled and typed back, absolutely. Your place or mine? Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual energy. Millions of people living their lives, making choices, falling in love, making mistakes, trying to figure out how to be better than they were yesterday. I was one of them now, fully and completely. Not trying to fit into someone else's world, not apologizing for who I was or where I came from. Just Maya Rodriguez, 7th grade history teacher, survivor, woman who knew her own worth. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. David Morrison and Madison Ashworth were getting married at the family estate in the Hamptons. The invitation was beautiful, elegant, and perfectly suited to their world. I didn't RSVP. Instead, I spent that weekend at my cousin's quinceañera in Queens, dancing to bachata and eating my tia's incredible mole, surrounded by people who loved me exactly as I was. It was the best weekend I'd had in years.